financial aid they may be otherwise eligible for. So I will talk about that very briefly today, but if you would like to go and watch the series on that, we can direct you to that former webinar where we did talk about that more in depth. We're also going to be talking about setting up scholarship funds. If you're charitably inclined and you want to leave a sort of a general scholarship fund for the community, or you want to specifically leave one through an organization, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can best do that, and maybe organizations that can step in and help you do that as well. And then kind of a sort of a what seems like an obvious option is leaving money directly to the school itself, or to the organization itself. That's obviously a kind of a very traditional option of, leaving a set of funds for a purpose to the school. And you have a lot of control over what those funds can be used for. It all comes down to how you designate it and what restrictions you place on it. There's also a lot of charitable giving that you can set up so that you sort of pass on your charitable inclinations to your family members. You can leave certain funds for them and, direct them to use those funds for charitable purposes, or a set amount of it for charitable purposes, and sort of give them those guidelines and hopefully carry on your charitable legacy through the next generation as well. So again, welcome. This is our final webinar in the education series for August. Next week, we're actually going to be talking about the new Secure Act that passed in January and how that will impact a lot of estate plans. It's a law that was passed regarding retirement accounts, qualified retirement accounts like IRAs and 401ks. So, next week we're going to go really in depth into that for you and then explain how that can really impact how you want to leave retirement accounts and what types of things you want to consider in your estate plan to deal with the new tax implications with that new bill. But today we are going to be talking about leaving an educational legacy for family members or for the community in general, or possibly through your alma mater. There's a lot of ways you can leave that educational legacy and through charitable giving. So the first is kind of a common one that people think about is, how do I leave funds for my family members? How do I make sure that they have that that support necessary to pay for college or for more non-traditional education expenses, like if it's a trade school, something like that. That is something we covered last week as well, as I had mentioned. So we are going to be able to provide a link to that webinar so you can watch that more in depth, but I will quickly go through kind of the idea of how best to do that right now as well. So first and foremost, whenever you're leaving funds for a family member to use for school, one consideration, one of the biggest, is to look at, are you trying to provide for the entire expense, or are they possibly eligible for certain amounts of financial aid? And if they are eligible for financial aid, the important thing is to make sure that you leave assets to them in a way that does not necessarily count against them for financial aid qualification. You don't necessarily want those assets to disrupt those benefits. It might not meet your goals that same way. And so there's specific assets that are countable for things like FAFSA and things that aren't necessarily. And if you're leaving a trust for your beneficiary, there are certain assets that you might want to designate to that trust or have that trust invest in so that they are not countable for financial aid and don't necessarily disqualify your loved one or family member from that. So again, if that is something you're more interested in, please send us a note in the chat box or send us an email, and we can direct you to that webinar. But today I want to talk more about charitable giving, through organizations or setting up funds in particular. So a big thing that people ask us about is, well, how do I best leave these funds? How do I make sure that I carry on my legacy or my, the goals of my legacy through these organizations? And there's really a couple different ways, and it depends on what your ultimate goal is with this. There's obviously giving during life, and there are ways to efficiently give during life to maximize tax benefits to you, minimize tax hits through IRAs, things like that. But there's also charitable bequests after you pass away and ways that you might want to set that up. And certain restrictions you want to place on those funds that you leave. So to start with the giving during life, one of the biggest considerations, as I mentioned, during life is making sure that you're doing so in a tax efficient way for you. Obviously, there are charitable deductions for income taxes, in general, but what a lot of people don't understand is there is a really good way to leave charitable donations through your IRA. Especially for people who, once they get to their required minimum distribution age and, maybe it's suddenly they're paying a lot more taxes on that than they were anticipating. Well, there are ways to make what's called a qualified charitable distribution from your IRA, 401k, those types of qualified accounts. What a charitable distribution is, a qualified charitable distribution is instead of taking the charitable distribution, the required minimum distribution from your IRA to yourself first, where the taxes would have to be paid, you direct the advisor or whoever is managing the IRA or 401k for you to instead make that election of a qualified charitable distribution, which then sends your required minimum distribution or some portion of it directly to the charitable organization. What that does then is it can satisfy your required minimum distribution for the year, and then you don't have to pay taxes on it. So if you are already going to make that charitable distribution from your own assets, a very tax efficient way to do that can be to, well, hey, I have to take this required minimum distribution, so I might as well make that same amount of charitable, bequest or whatever through that required minimum distribution, and therefore also not have to pay the taxes on it. So it's a really good option that a lot of people aren't aware of. And unfortunately, then you don't do that planning in the most tax efficient way because you are taking the distribution and then making the charitable bequest or gift for the year, which then, it's just not the most tax efficient way of doing that. There are also, donor advised funds you can set up through things like a community foundation. Here in the Fox Valley, we have a really good community foundation that, actually some of the materials you'll be receiving if you registered for this webinar are from them on how to best leave charitable funds and how they can work with you. So donor advised funds are where you provide the fund to, or the assets to the community foundation is one example of somebody who has a donor advised fund. Then you can sort of direct how they give, what your wishes are, what types of causes you care a lot about, and maybe things you just specifically don't want assets to be used for. So that you have a lot of control in, but they also help guide you in how best to do that. So it's a good place to sort of leave assets during your lifetime as well as after death. You can leave bequests through through community foundations as well. So a lot of what people want to talk about when they're looking at education legacies, especially, is leaving scholarship funds. And there are a lot of ways to do this. You can set up private scholarship funds. An important thing to consider whenever you're setting up a private scholarship or anything like that is making sure, if you intend for it to last quite a while, is to make sure that you have a way of sort of continuing on that legacy after you're gone, taking donations from people or having someone to manage that scholarship for you after you're gone. So private scholarships do require a lot more initial forethought and setting up and sort of, proper legal planning to get those in place. So they are more complex, but if it is something you want to do, you can absolutely do that. Another option, like I mentioned, through the community foundation is they have scholarship funds that you can give assets to and sort of say, I want to set up a scholarship for, maybe children with disabilities or, whatever it might be. And if you set it up through the community foundation, you can sort of have them invest the funds for you and try to keep it going as long as possible. And they will follow your wishes on that. So it's a really good option that requires a lot less initial setup on your part and, sort of making sure that you have someone to manage it after you're gone, because that's what they're there for. So scholarship funds are obviously great. options. You can also leave those privately, like I mentioned. Some people just want to leave funds directly to the institution themselves. If you're a Badger grad, for example, you went to UW, you can directly leave money to the school. And if you do this during your lifetime, you can leave it to certain organizations. So some people might have, fraternities or sororities that they were a part of, and they want to leave assets to, their local chapter, their school's chapter of that organization. So that's something you can do and say directly, hey, this is what I want this used for. Or you can leave it to the school itself, leave it to a certain department. That can be, a tax deduction for you as well. But specifically when you leave that sort of bequest after you've passed away, through your estate plan, you can put even more restrictions on it, because you're really saying, I am leaving this amount of money to this organization or to this school or to this, specific, part of the school. And I want it used for this. That's my wish. And it can't be used for X, Y, and Z, but maybe it can be used for A, B, and C. So you can really control a lot of that, because you are setting those rules in your estate plan and say, this is what it has to be used for. Now, you also want to be careful with that, though, because you can be overly restrictive. An example that I've heard was somebody left money. This was to a church, but left money to a bell choir, for example, and it had to be used for the bell choir. Well, the bell choir no longer existed. That money wasn't enough to fully support it. So they really struggled, the church did really struggle with, okay, well, now we have this money that we have to use for a bell choir, but we can't use for anything else, but we also don't have that bell choir anymore. So you don't want to be overly restrictive necessarily if you intend for, a bit more discretion with the institution you're leaving assets to, because you can potentially limit them too much, where then they just have this money that they have to try to figure out what to do with. Another option too, as I mentioned, is trying to leave the legacy or kind of give your charitable inclinations to your family that your beneficiaries you're leaving assets to as well. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Specifically through an estate plan is a really good way of doing that. You can say, I'm leaving, my son, my daughter, my grandchildren, this amount of money, and it has to be used for this type of purpose. So you can say, so much of it has to be used for charitable giving every year. You can specify percentages, what institutions it is, or you can, or they're leaving assets to, or you can actually kind of leave it up to them and say, it has to be used for some sort of charitable purpose, but I don't, I'm leaving it up to you to decide that, because I'm not trying to dictate your charitable wishes, but I do want you to continue on that charitable legacy in the family. So it's something that you can sort of leave, not just money as a legacy for charitable giving and for educational giving, but it's something you can really more sort of overall leave that legacy behind by instilling that sort of charitable inclination in your loved ones as well. There's, as I mentioned, the community foundation is a great option for that, for scholarship giving, because you can specify for the community as a whole, what sorts of scholarships you want to give out. You can set the restrictions on how many they give out every year, on who qualifies for this scholarship and who it's offered to. So you really have that control through organizations like the community foundation to leave that legacy behind. One thing too to be very careful of when you are leaving charitable bequests through your estate plan is making sure you're leaving it to the right charitable organization. So for just to give you an example, a lot of organizations have a national sort of headquarters, like a national organization that's saying, hey, we sort of manage all of these subchapters. Like the Red Cross, for example, is an international organization, but a lot of organizations like that have a subchapter or your local chapter of that organization. So, if I wanted to leave Red Cross of Wisconsin, for example, well, then you want to specify that, hey, I am leaving it specifically to the Red Cross of Wisconsin. And it had, again, you can specify further what it can be used for, Or you can sort of leave it more nebulous and say, I just want you to have the funds and use it how you see fit. But what you don't want to do is leave it to necessarily the international organization, unless that is your wish, if your intention was to leave it to the local organization. So it takes a lot of forethought and very specific language to make sure that that happens, but it is something you can do. The charitable giving through family members in particular, that is something, again, you want to make sure that it is actually going to be used for the purpose you're intending it to. I mean, you can obviously say, hey, I'm only going to use it, or I'm going to direct you to use it for certain purposes, but you want to make sure that it is what's best for them as well. If for whatever reason it isn't something that they're really going to be able to do for financial reasons, and they would better benefit themselves, maybe that's something you want to keep in mind as well. But with any sort of charitable giving, it takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of specific thought. There are a lot of people who try to set up private foundations for them, whatever their wishes are as well. And that is a great wish, and it is sometimes very doable depending on the situation. But anytime you want to set up a private foundation, you need to start thinking about what type of entity is that private foundation going to be. Are you filing it as a 501c3 organization where it's a charitable organization? Are you incorporating it? Is it what are you doing with that? What sort of legal background steps do you need to take before you can set up that foundation? The other thing being continuing funds. That is a big problem with setting up your own foundation is hey, if you can find a way to set up those continuing funds, that's great. But it is something that you need to consider before you try to set up your own private foundation through an estate plan, because sometimes those funds run out. And you really want to make sure that if your wish is for something to continue on, for a long period of time after you're gone, that you do that the right way. So when you're looking at kind of the difference between maybe a community foundation and a private foundation of your own, well, the community foundation has those kind of advisors there to look at, okay, here's the best way to do X, Y, and Z. You've directed them to say, hey, I want to use it for this fund or that fund. And they have investors there that can help you, grow your bequest over time and keep it going, depending on the type of fund you've set up with them. But private foundations, you have to do a lot of that background yourself, or have someone do it, pay someone to do it for you, basically, because it is a lot of work. I mean, these organizations do already exist, but if it is something you really want to do by setting up your own private organization, private foundation, make sure you're doing it the right way to meet your goals. There are a lot of sort of estate planning tools you can use to do charitable giving and charitable bequests as well. As I mentioned, you can specifically leave assets directly to an organization through a specific distribution, through a plan, or through a beneficiary designation on certain accounts. Sometimes you have a lot of tools available to you, but you may not know the best one. So a lot of times what we do is we use trusts to do charitable giving as well. A common example is when someone has a revocable living trust for their estate plan, they split the trust into certain percentages of charitable versus non-charitable, and maybe 30% to charity, and here's how I want that 30% to be split up, and with specific instructions if needed for how that money is to be used. But there's also during life tax planning you can use with certain types of charitable trusts. The two kind of main ones are a charitable remainder trust and a charitable lead trust. So those are different types of charitable trusts you can set up during your lifetime, and they function sort of the opposite of one another. So a charitable remainder trust is saying, hey, during my lifetime, I'm going to specify, or for a period of years, it depends on the terminology that you use, but for my life or for a period of years, I want, these individuals in my family or my friends to receive an income stream or distributions from this trust. And then after that period of years has passed, or I've passed away, the remainder will go to these charities. So that's a really good planning tool you can use if you are charitably inclined to do so, and you can receive some income tax deductions for it as well. A charitable lead trust is sort of the opposite of the charitable remainder trust, where you are during that period of years or during your lifetime using those distributions to a charity, and the remainder of that trust then goes to beneficiaries. So they are the opposite sort of each other, but they can receive similar results. It just sort of depends on what your tax planning goals are, and all of that. And that brings me to a good point with charitable giving. This is not purely an estate planning topic, right? A lot of what is right for your charitable planning goals and what sort of distributions you make, and in what accounts you do those distributions with, it's really a team effort between not only someone like me, the attorney, doing the planning for after you've passed away, but also your financial advisor or your tax advisor and all of that. Especially if you're looking at potentially having a taxable estate, which just to give you an idea of what that is. Currently, the exemption for a taxable estate is 11.58 million per person. So you have to have more than that to have an estate tax issue as a single person. You double that for married couples. So like 23.16 million. So if you have an estate tax goal or a planning issue in particular, that's even more of a reason to early on get your financial advisor involved, your tax advisor involved, and your estate planning attorney involved. And they can get together and help find the best way for you to leave those charitable distributions to minimize tax implications for you or for your family, especially if there's estate tax concerns. If you want to leave your entire estate to charity, then you don't have to worry about estate tax concerns because it's all going to charity anyway, and you get the deduction for that. So that just, is a good thing to consider anytime you're doing this type of charitable planning is not to go at it alone. It's very, obviously, as I've hopefully made clear, very complex to get involved in. Giving a yearly amount is totally, a lot of people do that, but trying to leave that legacy is much more complex than a lot of people think. That's why there's organizations like the Community Foundation or specific charities you can leave assets to, and certain estate planning, tools you can use to do so. That's why those exist, because it is complex, and you want to make sure that your goals are met the right way. The way you intended. You don't want to accidentally not have your wishes met because you didn't do the right planning to accomplish that goal. So with that, I just want to go through a couple of the materials. If you registered for this webinar, you'll be receiving from us. So we do have some of the charitable tools I was talking about estate planning wise. We do have through our little Charitable Giving estate planning booklet. We did also send you a whole heap of materials from the Community Foundation. They were kind enough to share that with us. In particular, if you're looking at estate or educational giving, they had some really good information on scholarship funds that I found very enlightening. And then also, my little favorite thing we have here for you is something that we sort of came up with, is the Qualified Charitable Distributions Guideline, and it is just a fun little diagram to explain how best to do those qualified charitable distributions from an IRA or a 401k type account. And again, this is for registered participants. So if you registered in advance, you will get these. We try to give these types of materials out to all and registered participants. So if this type of stuff interests you, absolutely register to our next webinar, which, as I mentioned previously, is about specifically more retirement account planning next week, because it is regarding the new Secure Act, which is the law Congress passed in January, I should say they passed it at the end of 2019, but it did come into play officially January 1st of this year, where it really impacts not only retirement required minimum distribution ages for you if you're the owner of the account, but also the length of time your children or your beneficiaries have to take out that account as the distribution over their lifetime. So a lot of that has changed, and If you haven't had your estate plan updated in, in years, it's a really good reason to get them looked at again. So that brings me to a good point. We do have, just as a reminder to everybody, if any of this charitable giving information sounded, brought up some concerns for you of, hey, I really do want to get involved in this kind of stuff, and I just need some assistance, some guidance with this, or I want to leave a bequest through my estate plan and I haven't done so yet, or set that up yet. We do offer a free initial consultation. So if that's something you're interested in, we would absolutely be happy to help you set that up. And our number is 920-993-0990. So if that is of interest to you, we absolutely would encourage you to reach out to us, and we can set that up, help you set that up, and maybe get you connected to the right people if you're also looking at lifetime giving. So with that, I just want to say thank you for joining me for the final webinar of our educational planning series. But if if this type of information is of interest to you, either reach out to us or please continue to keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars. We're trying to come up with new series every month. So if this kind of information is interesting to you, please feel free to register. But thanks, guys, and we'll see you next week.